AI is glorious, and without us, security professionals, it is going to be our doom. And I meant that. And I explained that we can argue about whether AI wants to do us any harm and whether it is an evil, but in the hands of the wrong people. And when people manipulate AI systems that will be increasingly connected to everything in our society, it is obvious that it is super dangerous. So this was me sort of putting some pressure on security professionals, to stay up to date.
Welcome back to Trust Versus, a podcast powered by HITRUST, a global leader in cybersecurity assurances. I'm Jeremy Huval, Innovation Officer with HITRUST.
And I'm Robert Booker, Strategy Officer with HITRUST. Jeremy, we and almost everybody in technology is somewhere in this AI journey. Really new and exciting capabilities, and organizations across the globe are looking to implement those capabilities provided by systems based on things like generative AI, also on top of a rich body of systems that have already been using machine learning for several years now.
Right. Organizations are trying to figure out their AI strategy. And I'm kind of using that term in air quotes, thinking about what Omar said earlier in the season, where AI is not a strategy, just like a screwdriver or hammer is not a strategy by itself. These are tools, and with any powerful tool that you bring into an organization, you've got to implement the guardrails, those protections, those safety systems to make sure you're maximizing the good while minimizing the bad.
Yeah, and I think many of our colleagues that are security leaders in this space, they're being challenged by this. How do I look at this problem? How do I understand the space and know what I need to do to, create those safety and security systems you're describing, Jeremy? Really getting engaged in the problem and being a part of the solution that companies are needing to implement to govern these new capabilities.
Right. And whenever organizations tackle a complex problem like this, they often look to publish standards and frameworks and white papers for guidance. And with AI, the problem is there's not one, there's hundreds of published standards and leading think pieces about how to do this right in the areas of AI security, AI governance, AI risk management, let alone all the other areas of responsible AI and trustworthy AI. So it's difficult to even know where to start. But in the AI security and risk management and governance space, if you do any research into the standards that are out there, a name you'll keep coming back to is Rob van der Veer. He's very, very active in a number of standard setting bodies and organizations. He helped chair ISO 5338. He helped chair the OWASP AI Exchange, and he's just a really popular speaker when it comes to AI security. And so we were really lucky to have him on. I thought it was a great interview.
Rob, so thank you so much for joining us. As we get started here, maybe just if you could give the audience a bit of your background, how you came to establish your expertise in security and privacy and the AI practice you established at the Software Improvement Group.
Thank you, Robert. It's a pleasure to be here. I have quite a long history with AI. I was a computer science guy, and I joined an AI startup at the beginning of the 90s, and we built all kinds of applications for example, arranging blind dates between people, for doing crime profiling and crime prediction even. And some of that stuff that we did back then, like, for example, individual crime profiling is currently sort of up for debate and will probably be forbidden in Europe because of the AI Act. I work with clients all around the world to help with their software implementations, to create great software, quality software, where I focus on security and privacy. And I have established the business units for security and privacy at Software Improvement Group, and also the business unit for artificial intelligence. And I do a lot in standardization because we want to spread the things that we learn in terms of sharing standards and guidelines. I do this through OWASP, through ISO. I was the lead author of ISO 5338, which is the standard on AI lifecycle, and Sense-Analyc, which is a European standardization organization working on the security standards for the AI Act. So currently, like you guys, probably experiencing there's never a dull moment with AI these days, right?
No, there really isn't. So you were really at the advent or the forefront of how AI works. When you look at where we are now, did you see the potential then?
I was surprised. And that surprise started about 2 years ago when I saw what transformer models could do, how they could, work with language. And everybody was, caught off guard by sort of the emerging properties of such models. The surprise started with transformer models, which are at the basis, as you know, of the generative AI that are responsible for the current revolution.
I think about the people that are doing the work now, the people that are both the scientists, the people that have really generated these transformative architectures and models that we're building upon, all the way to people that are consuming those models. And, as we look at that last 2 years, especially, how has the field evolved?
Yeah, the speed of innovation is, of course, enormous, as is the need to contain this, constrain this, to know the limitations, to understand the things that can go wrong and how to benefit from it. There are always two sides, right? There's the blue sky side of AI, and then there's the burning earth side, and we want to understand both. And we don't have sufficient insight into, the perspectives and the risks, and we're working hard on it. So there's a lot of groups working on threat modeling and security standards and trustworthy AI standards. And the innovation is sort of outpacing this. So that open letter, from a while back that was suggesting to keep a brief hold on the innovation of AI, that wasn't such a bad idea, because now we almost need to improvise and rush some of those standards in order to regulate AI. But it's necessary. So yeah, it's a race against the clock. That's how it feels.
I have thoroughly read a lot of your writings, Rob, including ISO 5338, probably about 6 times, and the AI Exchange and OWASP AI Exchange, probably 20 times. And so I feel like I've seen your bio before. I did want to ask, how did your keynote at the recent OWASP conference go in Lisbon? And can you talk about kind of what the content was of that presentation?
That was a fun thing to do. It was the opening keynote on Friday. Quite a large crowd. I think it was the largest crowd for me until then. I asked ChatGPT for some guidance the evening before, and it had some great tips. Take deep breaths. Start with a good statement. And the statement that I started with was, AI is glorious, and without us security professionals, it is going to be our doom. And I meant that. And I explained that we can argue about whether AI wants to do us any harm and whether it is an evil, but in the hands of the wrong people. And when people manipulate AI systems that will be increasingly connected to everything in our society, it is obvious that it is super dangerous. So this was me sort of putting some pressure on security professionals, to stay up to date and to then highlight some of the work that I'm doing indeed with 5338 and with the AI Act and with the OWASP AI Exchange. And it wasn't a structured talk in the sense of a lot of bullets, because it was a keynote and it needs to be entertaining, right? It needs to be a story. So I took people along some of the highlights of AI and some of the AI disasters, ranging from a photographer that I had a session with who sort of had cut my head off at the top, but it was the greatest picture. And he basically simply dragged up the frame, and the AI painted the rest of my my head and my hair perfectly, and it saved him a lot of time in his daily work, which was an illustration of a highlight of AI. But I had numerous disasters, including some of the things that I've been involved in with predictive policing, things like AI coding assistants making up packages that don't exist, that can then be hijacked by attackers. AI coding assistants making some severe mistakes that get overlooked. So I wanted to show both sides through some examples, and because they are part of my own personal experience, it still was a story with a beginning and an end. I love doing it. So that was, to me, was really an honor to do. And by the way, if you go to the OWASP AI Exchange on the media, you can find the recording of it if you want to watch it. But thanks for being so involved in my work, Jeremy. I appreciate it.
It's encouraging to see the amount of attention being brought to this issue. Obviously, we feel it's important. Before kind of going on the journey that I've been going on and taking HITRUST with me on really trying to tackle, is there a problem in the AI security space that needs to be solved? And, can HITRUST help with assurance and certifications in any way? The OWASP content specifically was just such a deep resource for us because it's just written in plain English. And like, if you start with, I don't know, NIST 100-2, a very important contribution to the area of, AI attack taxonomy and threats. It's not written in a manner that someone who's, starting on the journey can really appreciate. And I felt like the OWASP AI Exchange is, if you know IT systems and you know security and you want to understand AI threats and the fact that there is unique AI threats, it's a good place to start. And so this podcast isn't about just that, but I did want to pass sincere appreciation for it because it really helped a lot. Breaking down sort of the problem, it's been said before, there's security with AI. Like I can help my SOC teams be better at doing what they do. And then there's security against AI, which is, protecting yourself from AI-enabled bad guys and AI-enabled threats. And then there's security for AI. Can you talk about sort of how the world and how the standard setting bodies have started to come to document and build this taxonomy of AI security problems that are unique to AI as opposed to just a general security problem that is also applicable to an AI system?
Yeah, good question. The work by NIST, the taxonomy work is important. We were part of the review group for it. There is similar work from MITRE with the Atlas framework. There's great work from ANISA. There's great work from BSI, from ETSI. There are even some national standard bodies who are putting out great work. And frankly, it's a bit too much. It's also hard to coordinate, right? Because everybody needs these frameworks. So people start writing. But the problem is that alignment then becomes a problem. And we've seen this with, as you know, security standards also, which is why I built OpenCRE, which tries to link these standards together. You have this almost amplified now with AI security, which is why conversations between these standard makers are so important. And they're not easy to arrange because at the same time, they're working on their frameworks and then they need to align. And people come from different perspectives. Adversarial machine learning PhDs have a different view of the world compared to security people with some AI experience. And they're both right, but they need to align in terminology, in the way you look at risks. So trying to have those conversations is really important. We've been trying to fuel that from the AI Exchange by reaching out to the organizations that I mentioned. And if you're listening and you build an AI framework for security, and I didn't mention you, I'm sorry. It's all great that we're working on this, but at the same time, we need to align, make sure that we use the same terminology. And some of that is happening, and that's great. And we should keep on doing that, keep on pushing that material forward. One particularly important track for me is the development of the AI security requirements for the AI Act. These need to be clear in April of 2025. And in order to achieve that, have to be ready in draft in November this year. And I'm working on this with Sentinelic JTC 21 Workgroup 5. And thankfully, we also are able to include the work from OWASP straight into that working group, which allows us to have, a turnkey threat model and set of controls that we can then use to specify requirements. Because specifying requirements, as you know, is quite different from writing down useful guidelines. Because useful guidelines, You can specify, well, you can add noise and you can reduce your model and you can do adversarial training. Oh, but you can also do some detection runtime and you can do this and you can do that. And then talk a little bit about how these controls interact and some of the residual risk. But when you need to draw the line between products that can enter a market, in this case, the European market, and cannot enter it, you have to become really specific. So what is the amount of rate limiting and how do you test evasion attacks? How do you create a set of payloads that are representative of the state of the art? It's a challenge that hasn't even been solved for generic security standards, as you know, with the exception of, for example, common criteria, where you're dealing with protection profiles that are really specific, like database management systems. But for AI products in general, services or devices that need to come to the European market to write security requirements for those, we're trying to solve the unsolved generic applicable security requirements problem. And added to that, need to become specific also about the often mathematical aspects of AI security. So that's causing me and my working group members a lot of headache these days. And I think it's one of the important initiatives because the AI Act is, of course, about Europe, but what we develop there will hopefully help and inspire other organizations creating standards, creating guidelines to align with that and make sure that we have sort of a consensus in the world on how to regulate and how to sort of contain AI security issues.
Absolutely. Similar to privacy with GDPR, it'll have a global reach, certainly. And it's important work. And I can appreciate wholeheartedly the challenge of taking very meaningful and well thought out guidance and turning it into a set of, actionable requirements that is specific, measurable, actionable, like I said, time bound, and all the things you want of a requirement. And there's a balance, right, between I can be so specific in terms of like exactly how many rate, like the rate limiting, exactly how frequently and how much before I cut it or not, because the prescriptiveness won't be right for every organization. It's really common, I think, in many global AI regulations or standards to delineate between this is a high impact use of AI, maybe decisioning immigration, as opposed to a low impact of AI, where there's less consequence if the output is inaccurate, like routing a customer support call to the correct technician. Can you talk a little bit about what considerations go into making an AI-enabled system or an AI model high risk or high impact or of consequence as opposed to those that don't? And where's the thinking on that?
Yeah, the AI Act uses risk levels to set different levels of scrutiny when it comes to the regulation. So as you know, the high-risk systems like the one for immigration, but also when it comes to recruiting and policing, by the way, and the critical infrastructure, to name some examples, they need to apply security requirements, need to satisfy security requirements, for example, and a lot of other trustworthiness, etc. Requirements. So in that sense, the level of impact always connected to harm to individuals and to society. In that sense, that there's a strong analogy with the GDPR. Indeed, it is about protecting society, the AI Act, and that's important for organizations to realize. It's not about protecting the the stakes of the organization that applies the AI. It can be about the people whose data is in the training set. So, of course, organizations applying AI should look beyond that AI Act impact assessment, but also look beyond some of the requirements, because one of the typical AI threats is that the model gets stolen. That's a big issue if you spend a lot of money on developing that model, but it's typically not in scope of requirements for the AI Act, unless you use that model to create other attacks. That's a side note. But there's a set of threats that are not relevant from the perspective of harm to individuals, but they still need to be taken into account by organizations, which means that the AI Act can be a driver of getting serious about controlling AI for an organization. And at the same time, they have to apply, of course, a risk-driven approach where they also take other stakeholders, including business continuity and the value of their enterprise also into account.
That was really an interesting discussion. And I'm thinking about the inherent risk we're all facing as we step into this new technology. Rob had this one example about how AI helped his photographer avert disaster, with a photograph that was missing part of his head, and then contrasting that with some of his very early work on AI in a very sensitive area like criminal profiling. I mean, there's clearly a difference in risk between, my picture doesn't quite look right from a system that could make a decision that could cause somebody to possibly be denied certain, human rights that they have because they've been somehow characterized as a criminal or a possible criminal. Important distinctions to really understand when we look at this problem of risk management in the area of AI.
Right. And I think it's indicative of the fact that one size does not fit all for a set of AI controls or AI control environment, because there's so many different use cases and contexts by which machine learning and large language models are making themselves useful. And if you look at the different governmental regulations that are becoming popular right now, like EU AI Act and the Colorado AI Act and others, there's a common theme, and that is the sort of the impact tiering or the risk tiering of these AI uses. And I think it's a general acknowledgement that not all AI use cases are as risky as others. And so even how to tackle this basic question, like how risky is our own use case of AI? Is it high impact, low impact? It's not always as straightforward as it would seem. Like, people are rolling out machine learning chatbots or large language model chatbots to help triage incoming customer service requests to the right customer service agent. And we can all collectively say, if that breaks, it's not great, but it's not as impactful if like a medical decisioning machine learning model breaks and recommends the wrong dosing. So like one's more impactful than the other. They're not always as straightforward. And risk tiering is just one aspect of sort of overall risk management. It's such a deep area. We've just rolled out at HITRUST an AI risk management assessment and accompanying report that's based on the NIST AI risk management framework and ISO 23894, just to help organizations navigate these waters, because there is a lot of complexity here. And it's really important to start with effective risk management before you start implementing a bunch of controls, because they look like good ideas or it seems like the right answer to do on every one of our AI systems.
It's something that, a number of organizations are looking at, and this topic of governing AI and governing the risk of AI keeps coming up. And it's an area that, organizations are really looking for the roadmap or the guidance to know where to start. And I think, we feel like we've got, two solid bodies of work from ISO and NIST. You put them together, you actually get something even more rich and powerful. And it really does help organizations, tackle that important governance and risk management, problem. And then I think, Jeremy, as I look at Rob's background, I listen to what he's sharing with us. There's clearly some really important work coming from a lot of other people. You've mentioned that already, like the European AI Act, states like Colorado, how ISO's looking at the work. And then, I really do think this open source work from OWASP that Rob is so instrumental to is really valuable. And there's so much out there, as you've already said, but it does make me wonder, like, where do people start? How do we look at this problem from the beginning?
Yeah, it's certainly not a easy question to answer. I think maybe the most straightforward is to start with the controls framework that you're already using to address your general non-AI specific needs. And so if you adopt the right controls framework, it will be constantly adjusted to incorporate risk areas like AI, LLMs, machine learning. And if you're not, then maybe it's time to question, am I using the right control framework? Because ideally, you've got one that addresses all your needs: security, privacy, AI, traditional, foundational cybersecurity, all of it, as opposed to just having to piecemeal a bunch of different approaches. So anyway, it's not an easy question. We certainly don't have the answers. But this conversation with Rob is so indicative of this is a tough bit of content to navigate, because we're drowning in guidance. And someone that can help make sense of all of it and identify just the key bits of each is just so valuable. And that's why it was, great to talk to Rob. And let's get into the rest of the conversation.
And how does ISO 42001 play in? It's a management system standard as opposed to purely like an information security standard applicable to AI. Is someone trying to navigate this space, how should they slot ISO 42001 next to something like the security requirements for EU AI, or like any of the upcoming ISO AI security standard that will focus on AI security? How does that fit into the landscape? There's a certification aspect that's coming out. There's going to be like ISO 42001 lead auditor accreditations. So how does that fit in the security landscape specifically?
Yeah, I'm quite fond of the 42001. I think it's essential in order to control something. You need to have an inventory, and you need to do some impact assessment and some risk analysis, just like you do this with an information security management system. Every organization doing something with AI with some meaning and some risks needs to apply something like the 42001. And you can download the 42001 for a certain price, and then use it as inspiration for your own implementation of the system. I'm currently working on a guide for enterprises to do this in a sort of a pragmatic way, to use your ISMS risk repository to store your AI threats, to use your existing awareness training. There's so many things that organizations already have that they can build on to effectively create this AI management system. You're already doing data protection impact assessments, which hopefully involve harm to individuals, and you can extend that scope based on AI-specific aspects. You're already doing awareness training of individuals. In your organization, you have coding guidelines that you can extend. The worst thing you can do is build an AI framework that is treating AI in isolation. That is a separate thing that you then need to apply, and there's a lot of duplication in it, and you amplify the separation between AI teams and other software engineering teams, which we see in a lot of clients, unfortunately. And the goal is to bring these together. And you can sort of enhance that by applying an integrated approach. Now, the 42001 is a separate framework, but it's a governance framework. It's not about the controlling, right? Governance is about controlling the controlling. You need that. You need a process where there's a multidisciplinary committee, which is a typical best practice, an inventory of AI applications, and a checklist that you apply when you do your regular evaluation of those initiatives. Those are the important elements of AI governance, including upskilling, etc. But for the rest, you can build on what you already have in your CTO office, in your GRC, in your ISMS. So the brief answer to your question is everybody go do AI governance. You can use the 42001 as an inspiration. I don't expect this being mandatory, but I would very much appreciate if it would turn out to be a best practice in the market for organizations to get certified, because those certifications, as you know, can be just a driver to make it happen and do it seriously.
This part of the conversation is indicative of an earlier comment you made about there is so much by way of good thinking and standard setting bodies. If I remember right, it's the Alan Turing Institute who has the AI standardshub.org. And last time I looked at it, there was hundreds of standards, like not white papers, guidance, official standards. And so I think the value of this conversations like this are like, how to navigate, where to start. And so it's telling. The other thing I wanted to ask you about to lead up to the question, we have a number of organizations who look to HITRUST to understand, what requirements do I need to implement to help satisfy the risks to an acceptable level. I've got this AI-enabled system, or we're integrating the OpenAI API into our platform and using Gen AI. Hey, we heard you're doing some stuff on AI, and we just don't think there's anything here. Like it's just automation, and it's inside of our web application. We already know how to control that, and we're good at vulnerability scanning and penetration testing. So we're just not seeing much here by way of special stuff. So like, what are you trying to sell me again? What would you say to people like that by way of understanding that, yes, there is something unique here. There are specificities of AI that deserve special controls for the purpose. How would you explain that?
In that conversation, I would commend them in their perspective of approaching it from, it's not something extremely eccentric, but they should realize that there are serious threats involved. And what I typically do is then give a few examples of incidents or things that can go wrong, typically data poisoning, because the attack surface is so big and it's super difficult to detect, and the consequences can be enormous. So if you give an example like that, you can still sort of build on what they were already saying, which is nothing's new. Well, they're right in the sense that, yes, there are threats, but some of those are really serious and you need to understand them and do the evaluation. And maybe they have seen examples of AI threats that don't appeal to them too much, like, for example, prompt injection. That gets a lot of attention, but it depends on the situation whether it's a big risk or not. So they need to look at their own use case, do the evaluation, and they will certainly find a few AI security risks. And if they have trouble with that, I would help them, that they would then need to do something against. So yeah, do the threat modeling, do the risk assessment. Right, as you know, we have a section on that in the AI Exchange, where depending on the circumstances, they can find the relevant threats and then think about how bad that would be for them. And they typically, because it's so new to them, overlook some of those threats.
Who in a typical organization of moderate to large size should own AI risk management and AI governance? Should it be a single team? Should there be a new position set up for it? What's your thoughts?
Yeah, good one. Yeah, we've been contemplating about that one a lot. We started with the idea when building our pragmatic guide for AI readiness there needs to be somebody who's responsible for it. The thing is that if you assign somebody with responsibility for AI specifically, and that person is a very creative person who likes to create and set up things, you're fueling the risk of this becoming a separate framework and part of your organization. Whereas you would rather assign this to somebody who's lazy and wants to build on everything that's already there. But that's one side of it. The other side is that there is, regarding responsibilities, a great match between AI risks and roles that are already there. There's the DPO, there's the CISO, there's the CTO, there's the board, there's the people responsible for GRC. You need to, of course, make a sort of a RACI matrix where you specify who needs to be informed and who needs to be involved and who's responsible. But once you have that, there's hardly any role needed apart from perhaps a trailblazer, who makes sure that, well, at least AI governance gets set up and that multidisciplinary committee gets set up. But assigning all responsibilities on one person is, I think, a pitfall.
And in terms of oversight bodies, some organizations have gone as far as setting up a special AI oversight subcommittee of the board, or maybe an AI ethics committee. What are some of the factors that go into deciding, is our use of AI impactful enough, important enough to warrant a special oversight committee at the board level or with those charged with governance of the entire organization? Like, how risky, how impactful, how big do you have to get before you hit that threshold?
Yeah, that's a tough one because, there may be companies who have no really seriously riskful use case for AI. And when you then set up this whole committee, you might be overshooting things. I think it's important to stay in tune with the insight into risks as they evolve, which requires making an inventory of not just AI initiatives and AI use in the organization, but also AI ideas in the form of use cases, in the form of, rough ideas. Wouldn't it be nice if we did blah, blah, blah? And then when you do you run your checklists and evaluate that inventory, you might bump into things that make you think, okay, we need to set up this special committee because this is really serious or complex, and it requires further analysis. I think a best practice is to have a multidisciplinary AI committee that keeps track of these things. That committee, which can be 3 or 4 people with access to legal advice, or a legal person, a legal expert included, can have a look at those risk levels and assess them.
And in terms of innovation and the ability to move fast here, certainly generative AI is spawning a great deal of innovation. And there's a lot of organizations that I think it's been said that are in the kicking the tires phase of AI. We're going to prototype it. We're going to see if we can stand up better functionality in our existing products, or maybe just go as far as standing up a new product line based on this technology. But I'm sort of reconciling that with the most recent Harvard Business Review article that said most AI projects fail, and some estimates place the failure as high as 80%. And also, I see headlines about the big cloud providers are really tampering their revenue expectations associated with generative AI, because as you know, they went very hard in estimating explosive growth in this space. There certainly has been. And so what advice would you give to organizations that are considering or prototyping or have just stood up a generative AI aspect of their product or service in terms of expectation? Is it a moonshot every time? How do you gauge some of those risks?
It's certainly worth for almost every organization to experiment and to not stifle innovation, but contain it. For example, in sandboxes, there are companies that create sort of safe environments where you can experiment with AI, where there's, for example, no sensitive data involved, and then they can play around. The key is to try and also to fail early, even by failing into the idea in the idea stage. Right? There's this checklist of things that you need to check. For example, do we have the right expertise? And can we gain access to that expertise on the short term? And if you can't, then it's no use to pursue the idea. There's a couple of aspects, like, for example, discrimination bias. There are many examples of cases where ideas were canceled because it turned out they couldn't make an application where there was no discrimination bias. And in almost all of those cases, they could have known this from the start, which shows that you need to apply a level of scrutiny in the idea phase of initiatives to decide whether you want to pursue it or not.
You mentioned bias. Is bias a security threat? It's not part of NIST 100-2. Certainly bias can be introduced through model skewing attacks and data poisoning. How should a security practitioner or even a security framework dealing with AI treat bias? Should it be completely excluded and left to the realm of fairness and ethics?
Yeah, it's a really important topic. It's not in scope of security in the sort of the primary sense, but like you say, it can be part of the impact. So if somebody manipulates a model, it can show discrimination bias, which means that checking for discrimination bias can be a security countermeasure, right? And it's important as a security professional to be aware of that. But just like many other topics that are sort of on the border or outside of security, this is what I touched on in my Lisbon keynote recently, where I showed sort of a wayfinder with all the buzzwords around AI, including transparency and explanation and trustworthiness and fairness, and you name it. They're all things that interest us, also from a sort of a curiosity perspective. But my recommendation to the security professionals was focus on protecting the model, protecting the assets. And when you got that covered, then it's time, to work with your colleagues on the other aspects. At the same time, the typical talent of security people is that they're really good at thinking of what things can go wrong. And this is very handy when you talk about things like discrimination bias or even fairness issues. So some of that talent is helpful, to supply in the organizations. So I welcome all security professionals, to focus on their primary concerns, but then also when that is sufficiently covered, look at the other aspects and see if you can be of benefit as a doomsday thinker or, glass half empty, which can sort of, even though it's not always appreciated by colleagues, but can be very valuable.
Yeah, it's a unique skill that sets us apart and also drives everybody else crazy at the same time. Oh, what if this goes wrong? Yeah, we've waffled on the level of coverage for unwanted bias or intentional bias on our AI security content. Part of the argument is it's just an integrity issue. And isn't integrity part of CIA and that's security and that's it? But unfortunately, it's not that straightforward. I don't know if there's a clean answer, but I appreciate your perspective on it. It's reflective of, yes, it's important, but no, security can't do it alone, which I think is what I've come to understand. Similar question for transparency, explainability, and contestability. And maybe you can give our listeners a brief overview of that concept, TEC, in terms of AI, before you talk about, is TEC part of AI security? I know EU AI Act touches on it for even less than high risk systems. Where does that fit in?
So explanations and transparency are, of course, different things. Transparency is about knowing that AI is applied, for example, for a user or somebody who's affected by an AI system, and knowing how the model was created, what data was used. That allows an individual to anticipate a number of things and to get context on the response that the person got from a chatbot. If it's not a person, you need to know that's transparency. Explanation is typically about gaining trust, and that's where it gets interesting, because if you want to gain trust in a model, getting an explanation is probably the worst way, because if you explain how a complex model works, you'll be baffled by the impossibility of that working. It uses different frame of references, so it can only work against gaining trust. I mean, for most people, unless you're a data scientist, and you can use explanations to find some issues with your model. A better way to gain trust is to use representative test sets and do a test and measure your performance the way it aligns with its business value. So sometimes the importance of explanations are overrated. Of course, there are exceptions. For example, when you don't get a loan, you want to get an explanation of what you need to change in order to get that loan. I think that's a good example of a level of explanation that's at the level of the input variables that play the most important role. And it can, of course, help to identify the model using the wrong features, which can help you in troubleshooting issues with the model. There are approaches where you use a more explainable shadow model that helps you sort of explain how the model could be working, but a much better way to gain trust is to simply run tests with a representative test set.
So we're coming to the end of our time. I wish I had 2 hours to talk, because I can keep going. This is fascinating for me personally. Are there any other areas dealing with the AI standards, AI security standards world at large, or AI security that you feel like we need to cover?
I think it's important to know about the liaison partnership that we established between OWASP and Sensenelic that has profound effects. Typically, it is somewhat difficult to contribute to standards in international standard organizations, because you have to become part of a national committee and then join meetings and then keep track of when the next meeting is. There's a lot of overhead, which means that you need to have the time and the budget and the attention for it, which typically happens for larger companies. So the big tech are sort of overrepresented, even though it is a democratic structure, because of this tendency, you see an underrepresentation of small and medium enterprises who also have a lot of expertise, but also academia, who by definition are working on the state of the art. And we wanted to make this easier. And I did this with the 5338 for all kinds of cowboy constructions that were not illegal, but quite difficult to pull off. Now, through this liaisonship between OWASP and Sensenelic, it is possible to join or to start an OWASP project, which is an open source project. You need to gather a group of people, have some success, provide a good first version of your standard, and then you can apply with the OWASP board to see if you can join forces with one of the Sensenelic standardization working groups, and then contribute your work to that working group, and effectively, further disseminating your standard and also helping the formal international standards with your expertise. And I would welcome anybody to look into this. It is, of course, about security. It's not about every topic, but this OWASP gateway is, I think, something that can become important.
And it benefits us all. And I think the work that you've just discussed it contributes to the greater good, and better software and better systems and more secure and transparent avenues for all these things. So we're very much grateful for your efforts and the work that you do in OWASP and ISO standards and Sensenelic as well. And for being on the podcast. Thank you so much for this conversation and your time. You've been very generous.
It was lovely to chat with you guys.
I think we're so fortunate to have the opportunity to talk to people like Rob, because he's clearly all over this problem, Jeremy. And what I'm really struck by as I listen to him and we have the conversation is he's not just working one piece of the problem, he's leading across many different dimensions. And so, as I was thinking about it and reflecting on the challenges from the way I think about it, I think it does come down to risk mitigation, but there's a dimension of trust and transparency, ethical use of AI. What is a highly risky use case versus something much less risky? And we're really fortunate to have the opportunity to really hear from people that are, working these problems and really helping solve it on a world stage.
Right. Yeah, well said. The AI risk management, security, and governance problem is not an easy one to solve, but I think with guidance like what we've talked about across these very impactful standards, it's becoming more solvable, more approachable than ever before. And HITRUST is the beneficiary of a lot of this work by ISO, by NIST, and especially by the OWASP in the areas of AI security. And that's directly because of Rob's contributions. So we're very lucky to have his thought leadership to build on. And I think it does a lot of good for just the general problem space. So it was really cool to get to talk to him. Like I said, Rob can be found at Software Improvement Group. He's also accessible on owaspai.org. And he's got a really active LinkedIn. For example, he just published a recording of his keynote from the Global OWASP conference in Lisbon that he had just finished coming off of right at the time of recording. So there's a lot of resources there if you want to get in touch with him.
As we look at our work, we're at a real interesting milestone in our alignment with the framework that we've created around this area of AI security and AI risk management. We're just releasing a request for comment on a series of AI control selections that have been harmonized across many of the sources that Rob talked about today. That's going to be available in the market. We'll have a link to it in the description below. And we would invite anybody that's listening today that is a expert in this space or wants to learn more and wants to contribute to the work that we're creating to make this a better world for all of us in our use of AI and the security of AI, to take a look at that, provide us your feedback, let us know what you think. We'd be grateful for the input.
And as always, thank you so much for listening. Hopefully this is helpful. If you enjoyed the episode, please leave a comment or a positive review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. And until next time, thanks.